Hello. Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Sakeena Hughes. I'm a professor, assistant professor in the history department here at USI, and I'm so happy to see all of you here tonight. Thank you for coming. We have several thank yous because without our sponsors, this whole day and evening would not be possible. We'd like to thank the Office of the Provost, the College of Liberal Arts, the College of Nursing and Health Professions, the Pott College, the Romaine College of Business, the Counseling Center, the Office of Housing and Residence Life, Gender Studies, the Multicultural Center. We'd also like to thank our community partners, the Evansville African American Museum and the Evansville Vandenberg Public Library. We'd like to thank the President Roshan for his support over the years. And finally, I would like to thank the wonderful committee that I work with every year, my co-chair Denise Lynn, and all the members of the committee. They're really wonderful to work with and really do well putting this together. So this is Mandela Social Justice Day, and the mission of the day and the speaker series is to raise dialogue at USI around current issues of human and civil rights, public service, activism, and we want to do this through diverse, dynamic, nationally and internationally known public intellectuals, academics, and activists. We aim to augment each speaker's day with education opportunities for USI community. I hope some of you were able to go to our bystander training today and our Activism 101 training. Nelson Mandela was a South African nationalist. He was a democratic socialist. He was an anti-colonial freedom fighter, an anti-racist activist, and a political prisoner for a third of his long life. He was imprisoned for his efforts to liberate South Africans from apartheid, racism, and colonialism. In addition to fighting in these struggles, he also played a crucial part in reconciliation efforts and the recreation of South Africa as an interracial democracy. His legacy is inspirational to those who seek a world in which social justice reigns and human rights issues guide our leaders to create better societies. We remember that Mandela was considered a criminal in his country for standing up for what he believed was right and just. He made great sacrifices to make his world a better place, and we hope that this day will inspire you to take action to create a better society in your communities and to commemorate this great man and all the freedom fighters across the globe. Before I introduce Dr. Taylor, I'd like to make a plug. I want to share some exciting news with you. We are inaugurating our first Africana Studies minor here at USI. This minor will engage students. Yeah. Yeah, I'm so glad everybody's as excited as me. This minor will engage students in the study of Africa, African Americans, and other peoples of the African diaspora. And we are kicking off the minor with a day of recruitment. It's March 19th, and we're going to have a full day of events. At 10 o'clock on March 19th, we'll have a head wrapping session. Someone is going to come and teach us about head wraps from Africa to the Americas, and there'll be models, and you might even get your head wrapped if you want to. We'll also have a reggae concert. It's going to be in the Fireside Lounge, and that's at 11 on March 19th. And then in the evening at 5, we will be having a viewing of the movie Black Klansman and a panel afterwards to talk about it. So we're really excited to do this, and we hope that it helps you to get a better understanding of what we're going to do with the Africana Studies minor. Now for Dr. Taylor. Dr. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor is Assistant Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. Dr. Taylor is widely sought after public speaker and writer, In 2016, she was named one of the 100 most influential African Americans in the United States by The Root. She was appointed as a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians for 2018-19 and the Charles H. McIlwain University Preceptor at Princeton University for 2018. Her writing has been published in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Boston Review, Paris Review, The Guardian, The Nation, Souls, A Critical Journal of Black Politics, Culture and Society, Jacobin, and beyond. Dr. Taylor is the author of From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, an examination of the history and politics of Black America and the development of the social movements behind Black Lives Matter in response to police violence in the United States. This book asks how and why the Black Lives Matter movement, arguably the most broad and successful Black activism since the Civil Rights and Black Power eras, emerged during the tenure of the first Black president, and what that can reveal about prospects of building another sustained freedom movement in the United States. Dr. Taylor advocates for an independent, anti-capitalist, socialist movement spearheaded by African Americans, but based on intersectional solidarity among all those victimized by the growing economic inequality and state repression of the United States. Taylor has received the Landon Foundation's Cultural Freedom Award for an especially notable book. Dr. Taylor's most recent book, How We Get Free, Black Feminism and the Combahee River Collective, won the 2018 Lambda Literary Award for LGBTQ nonfiction. Dr. Taylor is currently completing a manuscript entitled Race for Profit, Black Home Ownership and the End of the Urban Crisis, which looks at the federal government's policies surrounding home ownership in Black communities after the urban rebellions of the 1960s. Dr. Taylor's research has been supported in part by a multi-year Northwestern University Presidential Fellowship, the Ford Foundation, and the Landon Foundation. Dr. Taylor was the Chancellor's Postdoctoral Research Associate in the Department of African American Studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 2013-14. Dr. Taylor received her PhD from the Department of African American Studies at Northwestern University in 2013. So without further ado, please help me to welcome Dr. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor to the stage. Hello.
So I am, it's February, so I've been giving a lot of talks. And I got the flu in California last week. So this is my first post-flu talk, so bear with me if I have to drink a lot of water. Very happy to be here. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me and bringing me here today. And I always like to say that I offer my talks in the spirit of provocation, meaning the provocation of thought. And I hope that, we have time for some discussion at the end, because that's where you get to react to my provocation, is in the discussion. So with that, I will get started. As we surpass the 2-year mark of the Trump administration, the shock of its open racism, sexism, xenophobia, and corruption has given way to a sharpening rise in struggles against it. Where in the several months after the shock of Trump's election gave rise to a nebulous and loose sense of resistance, the last year has been more clearly attuned to resistance that is rooted in struggle, organizing, and a deeper political clarity about what is at stake. While the fear that Trump represented a return to a much earlier period of open racism and hostility to non-white people in this country, combined with a callous disregard for the struggles of survival for ordinary working-class white people, evidenced by his cruel tax giveaway to the richest people in the United States, while simultaneously encouraging states to force Medicaid recipients to work for their access to medical benefits. Under Trump, the fused struggles of race and class have revived an acute sense of class struggle in the United States, the ongoing battle between the 1% and the 99%. But this has not been a one-sided affair, far from it. Over the last year, we have seen the emergence of significant and important struggles from the wave of rank-and-file-led teacher strikes, which have continued from West Virginia to Kentucky to Los Angeles to Denver and to now the teachers in Oakland, California. The strikes have helped break open a crucial discussion about taxes, why we need robust funding for the public sector, why public education and not privatized charter education is the way to go. But of even more consequence, the strikes have demonstrated how to challenge not only Trump and Trumpism, but the entire political project of austerity, budget cuts, and the unrelenting attacks on the living standards of ordinary people. It's not just the economic issues driving a real breathing resistance, but the women's marches, climate activism, have provided an outlet on social and economic issues. And in doing so, there is an open discussion about taxing the rich. Socialism is no longer a dirty word, and the pessimism at the beginning of the Trump term has given way to a growing belief that we can struggle and challenge his agenda. As the political expectations have begun to change, and there is a palpable sense that make demands not just to oppose the current administration, we must resist the temptation surely posed in this upcoming election to just get back to normal. Trump did not just appear out of nowhere. He was born out of the disappointment with 8 years of an Obama administration that did scarcely more than maintain the status quo in the lives of most regular people. With the great expectations from the Obama administration for reform and change after the disastrous Bush administration, including the entry of the U.S. into an illegal war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the drowning of New Orleans that was exacerbated by the ineptitude of the Bush administration, and the implosion of the United States economy. There were great expectations and then great disappointment with the administration to fundamentally change the direction of this country. For those who say those expectations for Obama were too high, I say that your expectations are too low. This is the richest country in the history of the world. We have over 500 billionaires in the United States alone. When it comes to war and militarism, there is not a single thing that the political establishment is unwilling to pay for. We have a right to demand nothing less than the same when it comes to raising the living standards and quality of life for the ordinary people of this country. But all of that to say is that the Trump administration was not an outlier or a strange breach with our long march towards progress. Instead, white supremacy, police violence, abject inequality, and racial subjugation are the durational cords that tie this administration to the very long lineage of American carnage in the name of empire and domination. In a country born of the genocide of the indigenous population here, enriched by centuries of forced labor by enslaved Africans, and where the wealth was multiplied by the violent expropriation of successive waves of immigrant labor. Trump is tradition, not subversion. The problems that we face transcend any one political party, president, or candidate for president. The Black Lives Matter movement has helped us to understand this more than anything else. As the movement unfolded in the shadows of the Occupy movement, it exposed that economic inequality was only one aspect of injustice in the United States. With the election of Trump, the movement has been less visible or active, even as police abuse and violence has continued in Black communities. But the need for a movement like Black Lives Matter persists. Even as new activism has emerged, in Black and Latinx communities, there continues to be a palpable feeling of ongoing crisis. For Latinx people, it's obvious. We have a president that is openly racist against Mexicans. Trump speaks disparagingly of Latinos at every opportunity, and the media continues to ask, is he really racist? As if immigrants, whether with documents or not, somehow do not count in that discussion. Trump's fake immigration crisis has emboldened immigration control and enforcement, ICE, to racially profile, harass, and detain anyone under suspicion of being Latino, having brown skin, regardless of their status. Trump likes to talk about the low unemployment rate among African Americans at 6%. It is remarkably low, but it is still almost double of what it is for white people. But the level of unemployment does not tell us all that we need to know about the economic condition of any people. It doesn't tell us about debt levels. It doesn't tell us about the ongoing gap between Black and white wealth accumulation. It doesn't tell us about the continuation of police abuse and violence. In other words, it doesn't tell us about the quality of life in Black communities. And the issues with policing cannot be seen in isolation of or separate from these broader economic issues. In fact, the economic issues are critical to understanding the policing issues. When the political establishment decides that it will no longer invest in the institutions or jobs or development necessary to revive neighborhoods and communities, it relies on policing instead. Police, in effect, become the public policy of last resort. This is why the emergence of the Black Lives Matter social movement was so critical. It dramatically expanded our understanding of the nature of policing in the United States and its connection to social inequality. It also showed us the limits of reform and why we must consider what Martin Luther King Jr. described as the radical reconstruction of the United States, as the ultimate objective of our ongoing struggle to create a just, free, and democratic society. In an essay published in a collection of his writings titled A Testament of Hope, Martin Luther King, it was published the year after his assassination, King wrote of the centrality of the African American struggle. He wrote, quote, "In these trying circumstances, the Black Revolution is much more than a struggle for the rights of Negroes. It is forcing America to face all of its interrelated flaws: racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism. It is exposing the evils that are rooted deeply in the whole structure of our society. It reveals systemic rather than superficial flaws, and it suggests that radical reconstruction of society itself is the real issue to be faced." Returning to the roots of the Black Lives Matter movement allows us to do three things. It helps us reject the romantic delusions of the past, while also exposing the interrelated flaws of racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism in U.S. society today. It shows us the explanatory power of social movements, but also the limits of reform in a society where oppression and exploitation are so embedded that they are constitutive of the society itself. The Ferguson Rebellion, August 2014, was democracy come alive. It is impossible to forecast when or where a rebellion against the status quo will erupt, but when it does, it immediately makes clear what is typically obscured by our society. This is what King was alluding to in terms of what the Black movement can expose. This meant multiple things in that summer. While the rise of Obama and the growth of the Black political class projected one image of Black America, the vast majority of African Americans remained hidden, invisible, disposable. The rise of the Black political class and economic elite not only represented Blackness as the flip side of whiteness, but through their own success, they insisted that the institutional, structured aspect of racial inequality in the United States was historical, a relic of the past. They professed that their existence was proof that the United States had changed. Where deprivation continued to exist, those who were deprived were resolutely blamed for conditions of their own making. Indeed, this became a calling card for Obama, making fun of the travails of poor African Americans in ways that would have been impossible for any white politician to engage in. Ferguson was a reminder that in the United States, history is always tied to the present. Indeed, we cannot make much sense of our current moment without a rich and engaged understanding of the past. As early as 1951, civil rights activists raised the slogan, "We charge genocide," to describe the complicity of the state with the murder of Black citizens by the hands of the police. They presented a petition to the United Nations in 1951 that read in part, quote, "Once the classic method of lynching was the rope, now it is the policeman's bullet. To many an American, the police are the government, certainly its most visible representative. We submit that the evidence suggests that the killing of Negroes has become police policy in the United States, and that police policy is the most practical expression of government policy." Ferguson was a reminder that this, quote, "most practical expression of government policy" had never changed. The murder of Michael Brown Jr. exposed the limits of so-called progress and the emptiness of the promises of a post-racial United States. Working class and poor Black people lifted the cloak on police abuse and violence and exposed its connection to wider systemic flaws. Ferguson exposed how policing could be used to discipline Black people generally with the threat of physical or economic violence. We learned that the Ferguson police and police throughout Missouri saw Black people, the arrest of Black people, or punishment as a source of revenue to offset taxing white people. The protest revealed how thousands of Black people had been entrapped by a system of legal fees and fines because they were seen as civically and socially disposable. In the eyes of the law and the legislators that the law was beholden to, Black lives did not matter. They treated Black people in ways that they could not get away with treating most white people. The heroism of Ferguson was then rooted in the ways that they overcame the fear that had been instilled by the ruthless and racist treatment of police for generations. In doing so, their protests, their uprising, generated an enormous sense of solidarity. But we not only marched in solidarity with our people in Ferguson, it compelled us to stand in opposition to what police were doing in our own cities, towns, and suburbs. Ferguson taught us all how to stand up and fight. The Ferguson Rebellion also showed what real democracy could look like when they refused to acquiesce to the chorus of liberal and Democratic Party operatives who told them to get off the streets. For them, democracy would be forged in the freedom of the street meetings, the night marches, and the demonstrations themselves. But before they were the Ferguson generation, they were the Obama generation. Young black people who had believed in the slogan, "Yes, we can," who had voted like they had never voted before, but who had also grown tired and wary of cheap campaign slogans, paternalistic scolding, and a lightweight political agenda that did next to nothing to restore the enormous losses wrought by the financial crisis of 2008. Once again, with big expectations from the first black president, came big disappointment with the failure to deliver. It was in the streets where the promise or even the possibility of democracy or their voice would finally be heard. The tributaries of Ferguson, Cleveland, Los Angeles, Staten Island, and many others fed the watershed that became Black Lives Matter in the late fall and young winter of 2014 and 2015. Tens of thousands of people across the country participated in acts of nonviolent civil disobedience. Lawyers, doctors, college students, high school students, nurses, professional athletes, ordinary people. On December 13th, 2014, 50,000 people marched through the streets of New York City with chants that connected Ferguson, Missouri to New York City and then to the nation. Hands up, don't shoot. I can't breathe. Black Lives Matter. There were protests across the nation in cities large and small. These scattered protests cohered through the chant, demand, declaration, Black Lives Matter, in ways similar to the cry of freedom now during the Civil Rights Movement. The Ferguson Rebellion would give way to the Baltimore Rebellion in April of 2015, when after the murder of 25-year-old Freddie Gray, questions persisted over how African Americans could overcome the violence and brutality of police. The recurrence of this violence forced larger questions about the movement from its friends and from its enemies. Black Lives Matter was chastised for raising bigger questions. The chastising came in the form of constantly asking, who was the leader of the movement? Activists were continually asked, what was the agenda of the movement? But not in ways intended to seek the answer, but in ways meant to undermine and demoralize the efforts of its activists. The constant inquiries were intended to divide a movement between those who, quote, want to get things done and who are perceived to be realistic and pragmatic, compared to those who are portrayed as unrealistic in their demands for systemic change. The political establishment, led by Barack Obama, sought to rescue the status quo by pressuring the movement to narrow its perspective and hem in its horizons, to shift its demands from what it wanted to what it deemed was possible. For example, when an activist, a black woman from Chicago named Aslin Pulley, refused to go to a closed-door meeting at the White House, Barack Obama personally called her out. He said, quote, "The value of social movements and activism is to get you at the table, to get you in the room, and then to start trying to figure out how is this problem going to be solved. You then have a responsibility to prepare an agenda that is achievable, that can institutionalize the change that you seek, and to engage the other side." This really showed how much of the criticism was about curtailing the deepening radical conclusions many activists were reaching. This included calls for abolishing the police, prisons, and demands for a massive redistribution of wealth and resources from the rich to the working class. In many ways, you could see how the Black Lives Matter movement contributed to the conditions that gave rise to the viability of Bernie Sanders' candidacy. And this was the real problem with the movement for the Democratic Party and their liberal supporters. In 1964, political activist and strategist Bayard Rustin argued that the civil rights movement and the new emergence of black uprisings in that year, 1964, needed to be prepared to shift from what he described from protest to politics. He argued, quote, "It is clear that Negro needs cannot be satisfied unless we go beyond what has so far been placed on the agenda. How are these radical objectives to be achieved? The answer is simple, deceptively so, through political power. We are challenged now to broaden our social vision to develop functional programs with concrete objectives." Rustin was suggesting that the shift into formal politics marked a sign of political maturity and offered an opportunity to deliver much more substantive change to black communities than protest alone could deliver. In many ways, it was a very reasonable proposition. Indeed, Rustin argued for this approach in 1964, and this was very much the trajectory that black politics followed along. One could say that the election of Barack Obama in 2008 was the culmination of that strategy, from protests to a black president. But more than 50 years later, that strategy has failed. Its failure lay at the root of the Baltimore uprising in 2015. If Freddie Gray could be murdered by a police chief in a city governed by a black woman as mayor, with a black police chief, where half of the city council was African American, 40 miles from Washington, D.C., where the first black president resided in the White House, where the first black attorney general ran the Department of Justice, and with more, at that time, black political representatives in Congress than at any other point in the nation's history. If none of those people could protect Freddie Gray from having his neck broken by the Baltimore police, then black people need more than just politics and black elected officials. Indeed, the focus on electoral politics, especially coming out of Black Lives Matter, misses the way that the social movement itself, along with protests and demonstrations, have been fundamental to achieving what we consider to be progress in this country. In the 1960s, when African Americans were almost completely locked out of positions of power, it could make sense that the next step was electoral politics. But then and now, the pivot to elections has distracted from the most important task, which is building the biggest, broadest, and most multiracial movement possible to not only fight against Trumpism, but to fight for the things that we want, including an end to police abuse and violence. The social movement is the mechanism that preserves the interest of those outside the corrupting and tranquilizing influence of electoral politics. Everything that we have resembling progress has come through struggle. It has come through the urgency, determination, and creativity of ordinary people. Osleen Pulley, the working-class black woman from Chicago that Barack Obama personally chastised for refusing to partake in a meeting convened at the White House, had a vastly different vision of change compared to the one offered by the president. She wrote in an open letter in response to Barack Obama and others who criticized her, quote, "I could not with any integrity participate in such a sham that would only serve to legitimize the false narrative that the government is working to end police brutality and the institutional racism that fuels it. For the increasing number of families fighting for justice and dignity for their kin slain by the police, I refuse to give its perpetuators and enablers political cover by making an appearance among them. We assert that true revolutionary and systemic change will ultimately only be brought forth by ordinary working people, students, and youth, organizing, marching, and taking power from the corrupt elites. The transformative power of the social movement is not only about its coercive influence in policymaking or the governing institutions of our country, generally speaking, but we must consider the power of collective organizing and the movement on ourselves. The radical artist and critic John Berger, in 1968, wrote of mass demonstrations, saying, quote, "Theoretically, demonstrations are meant to reveal the strength of popular opinion or feeling. Theoretically, they are an appeal to the democratic conscience of the state. In this sense," Berger wrote, "the numbers present at a protest are significant not because of their impact on the state, but on those who participate." He continued, "The importance of the numbers involved is to be found in the direct experience of those taking part in or sympathetically witnessing the demonstration. For them, the numbers cease to be numbers and become the evidence of their senses, the conclusion of their imagination. The larger the demonstration, the more powerful and immediate, visible, audible, tangible a metaphor it becomes for their total collective strength. The point is that movements not only create the possibility of changing our material conditions by exerting the force of the many upon the intransigence of the few, but social movements create arenas where we ourselves can be transformed. The mass movement breaks us from the isolation of everyday life. In this society that deifies the lie of rugged individualism, an idea that wrongly attributes our successes to our personal ingenuity and blames our failures on personal weakness and defect, the mass movement is that arena, that arena of struggle brings us together to share in our failure and to show our connection and relationship to each other. The prevailing ideas in our society reinforce the sense of fragmentation and disconnection. But struggle shows what we have in common. It pierces the prevailing common sense about our society. What you see is not what you get. We must challenge the simple narratives fed to us that are intended to make sense of the world we live in. The Black radical feminist and organizer Ella Baker understood this. She wrote that if we are serious about transforming society, then we must understand society. And if we are to understand society, we must look more deeply and not accept at face value what we are told to be true. She said in 1969, quote, "In order for us as poor and oppressed people to become a part of society that is meaningful, the system under which we now exist has to be radically changed. This means that we are going to have to learn to think in radical terms." And I use the term radical in its original meaning, getting down to and understanding the root cause. It means facing a system that does not lend itself to your needs and devising means by which you change that system. Radical, in Latin, means root. Black Lives Matter has opened this possibility, but also raised more questions. Black Lives Matter has exposed police brutality as something deeper and more pernicious in American society. But it has also emboldened a generation of young people to want and demand more. We have to use it as an opportunity to see how the racism that allows the existence of violent and abusive policing also allows for the subjugation of undocumented immigrants, who in turn are subjected to a kind of violent and abusive policing at the border and throughout this country. The billions of dollars dedicated to policing social crises should compel us to ask whether this money could be spent creating a more equitable society. And this is a problem not only for Black and Latino people, but there are 20 million poor white people in this country. White working class and poor communities are being devastated by a crisis of despair that is borne out in opioid addiction, alcoholism, and suicide. Life expectancy for working class women, white women, has reversed and begun to decline. This is an unheard of phenomenon in the developed world, let alone in the richest country in the world. These are not the evidence of white privilege, they are the markers of white despair. But we come no closer to solving black oppression or working class white oppression by denying one to address the other. We have to point to how they are connected and why anti-racism and solidarity are the only way to seriously confront both crises. Black Lives Matter is an entry point into an examination of a society that locks people into perpetual poverty and inequality and then cages and ruthlessly punishes them when they dare to challenge or reject their condition. Social movements can certainly challenge the methods of policing, the conditions that make black people vulnerable to policing, and they can even get some methods of policing or incarceration to stop. But social movements intended to reform this system of inequality cannot undo policing, prisons, jails, poverty, and the racism that makes it all acceptable in our society. These conditions are rooted in a profit system that operates in ways that creates enormous riches for a tiny percent of the population, while producing enormous hardship and misery for millions more. And then that uses racism to explain away its inequality. They say that black people are lazy, trying to drive walls and wedges between black, white, Mexican, Muslim, and all who have an interest in fighting alongside each other. This, of course, is the secret to Trump's madness. He and the Republican Party are not just racist for the mere sake of being racist. They wield racism to explain away the inequality and poverty they lord over. They want ordinary white people to believe that their declining standard of living is because of immigrants. They want them to believe that their access to health care is threatened by the march of refugees from Honduras seeking political asylum. They want them to believe that their insecurity that they are experiencing is caused by, quote, the blacks. The crises we face are problems of the market, meaning that they are permanent features of our society. Misery means profit. Hunger means profit. Disease means profit. Addiction means profit. Prisons mean profit. Racism means profit. Capitalism is killing our planet, and it threatens to destroy the future of millions. These are crises that extend beyond the capabilities of our two-party system. It is true that there are better or worse elected officials, but what can never be forgotten is that in the constant weighing of who or what party is the greater or lesser evil, we never engage with the larger issue of how we get free. The best of the black radical tradition has always understood that black liberation, the idea that black people can live free of physical, economic, social coercion, cannot be achieved within capitalism. But the dialectic of reform and revolution cannot be unleashed by privileging one above the other. Instead, the fight for our daily lives is a precondition for imagining a different world altogether. Black Lives Matter as a belief, an utterance, a collective chant, and a possibility is an example of this. From Ferguson to the Baltimore Rebellion, the commitment, solidarity, and struggles of young black people provided a glimpse of freedom to those living under the policeman's boot for so long. But those struggles are only the beginning. The Black Women's Manifesto, published in 1970 by the Third World Women's Alliance, described how we go from the struggles of one to the struggles of many. Quote, "The new world that we are struggling to create must destroy oppression of any type. The value of this new system will be determined by the status of those persons who are presently most oppressed. Unless women in any enslaved nation are completely liberated, the change cannot really be called a revolution. A people's revolution that engages the participation of every member of the community, including men and women, brings about a certain transformation in the participants as a result of this participation. Once you have caught a glimpse of freedom or tasted a bit of self-determination, you can't go back to the old routines that were established under a racist capitalist regime. Another world is possible, but we are the only ones who can create it. No one is coming to save us. We must join together to save ourselves. Thank you.
While we're working on a microphone situation, I think we'll go ahead and start. And if we get a microphone, and if I interrupt you and hand you a microphone, just go ahead and use it. We'll get it going. And if you could, while we're waiting on the microphone, if you could stand up and kind of project so everyone can hear you.
Including me.
Yeah, including us, because it is kind of hard to hear.
If I had written it down correctly, did you say black liberation cannot be achieved through capitalism? Is that what you had stated?
Yes.
What's your solution to that? Instead of capitalism, what do you think should be in place?
I think that what I was trying to get to towards the end, which is probably more of a critique of the current order, is that I said earlier in the talk that the entire history of the country is so steeped in the oppression and exploitation of African Americans that those features are constitutive of the country itself, meaning they are what make up part of what we understand the United States to be. And so for me, that means that the idea that then the liberation, if we think about that as life absent of physical, economic, social, and political coercion could exist in this country, is incompatible. And so I think that means that we have to have a society that is actually free of oppression and exploitation for that to even be a possibility. So that's less predictive or prescriptive of what should replace it, and more about the impossibility, which doesn't mean the impossibility of struggle, because obviously the entire history of African Americans in this country is one of struggle. But I'm really trying to get us to think beyond that which exists, because that often are thinking about what society could be like, what freedom could be like, is so tightly pinned to what actually exists that I believe it limits our imagination of what else that could look like.
Now we have a microphone. So, thank you. Who else has a question for Dr. Taylor?
Question or comment, it's okay.
I'm going to come to you real quick.
So is this thing on? Okay. I know you mentioned
Speak up a little bit.
I know you mentioned at some point in your talk that you were working to create a multiracial movement. Are there any organizations that you have worked with or you are working with that are representatives of the Hispanic community?
Well, what I'm talking about is not really about specific organizations. It's more about, because one of the things I was talking about towards the end of the talk is the quote, mass movement. And so the mass movement, the way that I conceptualize that or think about that is not about a specific organization. It is about the coming together of different groups of people who have different struggles that they're engaged in, but who come to see that there's a common aspect to all of these different struggles that allow them to combine their efforts into not necessarily a single movement, but one that is not just confined to my particular issue or your particular issue. And so I write a lot about and think about this concept of solidarity, the idea that you don't have to experience a particular oppression or exploitation to be motivated to fight against it, to do something about it. In the labor movement at the end of the 19th century, turning into the 20th century, the Knights of Labor coined a phrase called an injury to one is an injury to all, to indicate this, that even if you weren't the direct recipient of a particular harm, that we understand that we all have an interest in struggling against this common thing. And so it's upon that basis that we can talk about the potential of a mass movement. And it's potential. It's not just because something should happen or that it would be desirous for it to happen doesn't mean that it will. And being able to overcome differences that are real and that are deeply embedded in this country is very difficult and has to be quite intentional and strategic. But to me, that should be the direction of things.
Thank you very much.
There it works. I just had a quick question from your book, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. Mm-hmm. At the end of one of the chapters, you say that there must be more organization and coordination in the move from protest to movement. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's still taking place, or how far along is the Black Lives Matter movement in that development phase, in your opinion?
Yeah, so that's the end of the chapter on Black Lives Matter, and I would say far away from that. And I think that, when I wrote that in 2015, I felt that it was pretty imperative for the movement to be able to move forward, to take up that it couldn't just be about mobilization. It had to be about understanding what movement building would look like, and that most fundamentally the movement had to grow, and that is also very intentional. It's not just because you exist. People will come out to protest, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they understand how or what it means to get involved. And so I think that one of the problems that the movement has had is that there were lots of political debates about what direction the struggle should go into, and not very many forums to take up that debate. And so there never emerged a kind of national convening or national body within Black Lives Matter to really debate out a strategy and tactics for how to take the movement forward. So it meant that a lot of groups that were foundation-based kind of went into their own organizing mode. And I think one of the the main focus points of the organizing became centered around policy reform, which is, if you look at the influence of progressive foundations and non-governmental organizations, it's almost always centered around policy as the sort of pragmatic end game for social movements. And the problem with something like police abuse and violence is that, it's very difficult to deal with that strictly through a policy initiative, which is what a lot of activists encountered, which meant that for a section of them, they began to draw much more radical conclusions about the nature of policing, the nature of the criminal justice system in the United States. But without a real format to take up these debates in the movement, each group just kind of went and did its own thing and diluted its collective strength, which is what made Black Lives Matter powerful in the first place. And so now I think that we're at a point, a very low point, where the movement is very diffuse, very fragmented, and groups are isolated unto themselves. And so that collective aspect of the movement is at a low right now.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
So with the current administration in the U.S. government right now, we've seen for the first time that the types of policies that have been affecting minority groups for so long are starting to affect everyday white people, like you were speaking about in your talk. And I just wanted to ask how optimistic you were about change now that things are affecting the group in power. Because for me, this is obviously it's a horrible situation that things are continuing to be bad and that the government up to this point seems to be better and better at concealing these sort of things that it's doing, repressive acts. But now that it's more out in the open with the Trump administration and the audacity of the Trump administration has kind of brought it to light, are you more optimistic that change will follow, especially now that, like you were speaking about, white people are being affected by these policies?
Oh, I think, now compared to 2 years ago, I'm like wildly optimistic. I think 2 years ago, I think everybody was confused, what just happened, that sort of thing. And I think that the shock of that, this is some of what I was talking about at the beginning, the shock of that has really subsided. And what we've seen in the last year is just an enormous outpouring of protest, that people are no longer sort of overwhelmed and just, horrified, but that there's organizing and struggle. I think the most, I kind of went through it, but the most inspiring and I think important examples of that have been the teacher strikes from West Virginia to California over the last year, because if you think about the way that public education has been so eroded and worn down, teachers have become a punching bag for both political parties, that teachers could organize, defy the national leadership of their unions, the local leaderships of their unions, take their own future by their own hands and go out on strike in so-called red states where you're not supposed to be able to do those sorts of things, and win decisively, I think shows provides not necessarily a blueprint, but a framework for how not just Trump, but Trumpism and the whole notion of budget cuts and austerity that is supposed to be absorbed by ordinary people. It provides a framework for how to resist that. And if you combine that with a lot of the social movement organizing, whether it's the women marches, the marches against climate change, any number of arenas where people are in struggle, trying to figure out what to do. You can see that the constitutive elements for a mass movement exist. Now, you throw into the mix 55,000 people in the Democratic Socialists of America, compared to, I think they had 5,000 members or 2,000 members in 2016 before Trump was elected. And so what we have is a very sharp political polarization in this country. It's not just the growth of the right, it's not just the growth of the left, it's both happening at the same time. And so part of that, what is required then in the moment, is politics and understanding why that's happening, but also what then have to be the next steps, not just for mobilizations, but how do we knit together the different struggles? How do we connect them to a resurgent labor movement? These are all of the questions that people who think about these things, who see themselves as part of a broad left, are trying to think about right now. And so that is much more exciting than anything that any of us were talking about, 2.5 years ago.
Thank you.
Sure.
Right here, and then we're going to come all the way down. Okay, so you said something along the lines that achieving the desired social equality should be based in protest, not in politics. Is that more of a revolutionary mindset, or does that eventually lead back into politics and legislation?
Wait, say that again. I'm sorry. Just speak up a little bit.
You said something along the line that achieving the desired social equality should be based in protest, not in politics. Is that more of a revolutionary mindset, or does that protest eventually lead back into politics and legislation?
Oh, I'm I think I'm talking more about formal electoral politics. I think that, I think too often we have been trained to think about the Democrat and Republican parties, the electoral realm, as the place where politics happens. And I think that's why a lot of people say that they're not interested in politics, that they don't like politics, that they don't want to talk about politics, because, if you think that, politics is about a kind of duplicitous, party of millionaires for the rich, or an inept party of millionaires for, other people, then that's kind of hopeless. So I think there's I said at the end, a dialectic of reform and revolution, which is to say that you can't just say, none of this is working, on Wednesday we want a totally different way of functioning as a society. It doesn't work like that. And so what change is about is how ordinary people are taught to believe that, you can make incremental changes through various institutions within society. And then they try that, and it doesn't work. And that raises questions about why it doesn't work. And then sometimes people go into struggle and, do happen to make some things change because there's an incredible amount of pressure put on the establishment. And that might make them want to struggle for even bigger changes. And within that, questions develop and arise as to why is it so difficult to change things that are considered changes for the better, that are considered improvement. And sometimes within that, develop the idea that, well, maybe society should be organized in a different way. And so that's not necessarily a linear process. It's a process that goes in many different directions. It doesn't start out as a revolutionary consciousness. It starts out as wanting to change things, And so there's some element of both of those, really radical change and just wanting things to change, that the resistance to raises bigger questions.
We're on the other side of the room now.
Okay.
Hi.
Hey.
You mentioned the fact that we are the wealthiest country in the world, and we have a continually growing income inequality between white and black Americans. What are your thoughts on Ta-Nehisi Coates and others' call for reparations? We have the means. Do you think it would improve circumstances or help us move forward?
I'm of two minds with reparations. I saw that there was, I don't know, was it a town hall or something where all of these Democrats who were running came out for reparations. And I'm wary of people who say they are for reparations, but they're also for the privatization of public services and the public sector, because it's like giving you something in one hand and then taking it from another. I think that one of the effective arguments around reparations that Ta-Nehisi Coates makes is that he takes the debate and argument out of the 19th century, or he takes it out of the question of slavery, where everyone is immediately like, well, I didn't own slaves, and brings it into the 20th century by looking at the ways that African Americans were systematically robbed by the federal government, especially around the question of home ownership. And so I don't know if people know this. There's a great book that you could read called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein that talks about how the U.S. government segregated America. Now, what does this book talk about? Well, in the 1930s, the federal government set up an agency called the Federal Housing Administration. It was during the Depression. The Federal Housing Administration was tasked with creating homeowners in the United States as a way of stimulating the economy. And so the way that it worked is that the FHA would insure mortgages loaned out by banks so that the banks during the Depression would no longer be afraid to lend out their money. Now, so basically the FHA was an insurance company, but owned by the government. Now, the only way you could get this insurance, which was necessary in order for the banks to lend you money, was you had to be white and you had to live in the suburbs. And so it meant that by 1960, 60% of white people were homeowners in FHA-backed housing, and 42% of black people were homeowners, but only 2% of them were in FHA-backed housing. Because black people could not get insurance from this federal agency, they had to take out predatory, expensive loans in order to get their houses. And so here you have a government policy that is completely unfair. So if you get an FHA house in the 1940s and 1950s, you're paying 5% down and on a 5 or 6% interest rate. For black people, if you wanted a house, you pay 20% down on a 10% interest rate. And so then you multiply that over the life of a mortgage. And so this, what Coates does by bringing this into the reparations debate is takes the abstract who owned a slave or not out of the debate. These are your grandparents and your great-grandparents. These are people who are still alive. And so it means that white people got the benefit, millions of white people, not all, but millions of white people got the benefit of a socially accruing asset in the form of home ownership, where millions upon millions of black people got debt. And so I am for, I don't know how it would be done, but some kind of financial restitution and redress for that, that kind of exploitation that existed in African American communities. It remains the reason why there is this enormous wealth gap between blacks and whites. The median wealth accumulation for white people is $141,000. For black people, it's $11,000. And it is all about access to home ownership. And so I think that deserves to be redressed. Now, I think more generally, reparations doesn't address the way that the system is organized to reproduce this wealth inequality. And so instead of cutting checks, you know, for some people and then just saying, okay, we've solved all of these problems, I think that, you know, we need a fully funded public education system. We need fully funded subsidies, not to private industry, but for housing. Housing is grossly expensive in this country. Most people are paying far more than what is prescribed. You are only, if you are paying more than 25% of your income on housing, then you are not living in affordable housing. And that millions of people qualify as not living in affordable housing. Our entire public infrastructure has been devalued, underfunded. And meanwhile, I said this earlier with the group of students, the budget for the Department of Defense this year is $717 billion. $200 billion more than the Department of Defense asked for. And so there is an enormous amount of money and wealth in this country, and it is systematically not used to pay for things that the general public wants: healthcare, education, all of these things. And so I think that is the bigger fight, more so than reparations, because that's about how do we create an equal and just society. And if we had that, people wouldn't be asking about reparations. People want to ask about reparations because we live in an unjust and undemocratic society. And so if we were able to redistribute the resources and wealth in such a way that created a just society, I think that would be less of a question.
We got time for a couple more questions.
First off, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
I was wondering, whenever Black Lives Matter first became popularized, so did groups like Anti-Racist Action and Anti-Fascist Action. I was wondering if you would mind commenting on whether or not those groups assisted or disparaged Black Lives Matter?
I don't know. I think those kind of develop out of different currents. I certainly don't think they disparaged Black Lives Matter, but groups like the ARA, the Anti-Racist Action, developed out of, this comes more out of an anti-fascist lineage than necessarily protest against police brutality. If anything, I think that Black Lives Matter missed an opportunity in the sort of developing anti-racist movements that have tried to build big protests in the aftermath of Charlottesville against organized racists, and really have not seen that as an arena of political struggle that they should engage in, which I think is a mistake.
Thank you for speaking today.
What would your response be to people, especially on the left, who advocate for a spirit of centrism in the coming election cycle, kind of relying on that old argument of, we didn't get behind Hillary, so Trump got elected, when a lot of people on the left, or a lot of people that were, progressives, kind of felt betrayed by Debbie Wasserman Schultz and some other people? Just kind of what your thoughts were on that.
I think the center is dead. There is no center in American politics. I think so much of, politics in this country happen on the right, and I think that what we've seen, in the aftermath of 2016. The assessment that the Democratic Party had was that first it was Bernie's fault, then it was the Russians. There was a lot of stuff except dealing with the fact that Hillary Clinton, in the midst of crisis in lots of communities, people talk about unemployment rates, but the opioid crisis, the crisis even that when you have a job and you can't make ends meet, right? Because of inflation, because of debt, because of the enormous debt that people are drowning in. And to run a campaign where your slogan is America's already great is just to be so completely out of touch with what is happening. And so I think that they have figured that out. And the people who are trying to hold the center now, the senator from Minnesota, I can never say her last name, Amy. Yeah. I mean, she doesn't stand a chance. She doesn't stand. Joe Biden wants to join the race and talk about how millennials just complain and, rich people aren't. Good luck. Good luck running on that in this election. So there's a reason why Bernie Sanders raised like $6 million in 15 minutes, is because that's what people want. People want a real program to basically capture some of what has been taken away. And so talking about, well, we're not ready for Medicare for all. Well, what are you waiting on? When will we be ready for universal health care in this country when it exists everywhere else in the peer nations of the U.S.? What are we waiting on, And you just think about all these things, right? We say that education makes for well-rounded citizens, informed people. Then why do we have to pay for it? Healthcare. The human race cannot survive without medical intervention. Why do we have to pay for it? You go to housing. We can't live without shelter. Why do we have to pay for it? And so some people don't like that, and they'll freak out. But a lot of people are sick of working hard, doing all the things that they're told that that's what you're supposed to, and you can't get ahead. And it has nothing to do with your effort, has nothing to do with any of that. It's because the system is rigged against you. Jeff Bezos, no taxes, the richest man on earth. Why is he so rich? Because workers at Amazon are so broke, right? That's how he gets rich. Paying people nothing is how he gets rich. So I think people are sick of it. Not everyone, but enough people. And so that middle-of-the-road crap of, tax breaks for whatever, or whatever mealy-mouthed crap, they want to pitch to people, I just don't think anybody's interested in that right now. And that's why Kamala Harris has gone from being the prosecutor. She came out for legalizing sex work today. She's legalizing drugs. I mean, people understand that the center is dead. And so, they're racing to figure out, what's in Bernie's program? Can we fake it? And so I think it's a new political, moment. Now, most of those people will be full of it and not actually mean it. But it's a different, the the debate will have to happen on different terms than it has in any recent memory in American politics. Okay, one more.
One more. We got one more question.
My question is about your book.
Yeah.
I haven't read it yet, but what is it exactly following? Do you tell this guy's story, or do you stay with what happened, or is it like how to solve the problem? Like, what is it about exactly?
Whose problem?
Like the whole problem. Your book, Black Lives Matter, with the police. I just wanted to know: is it about how to solve that problem, or is it like following, just telling the story?
It's not telling a story. It's a history of black politics and black activism over the 20th century into the 21st century. It kind of looks at Black Lives Matter as a historical problem and not this thing that just kind of appeared out of nowhere, but that has long roots in the United States. And so I look at those roots and see what we can derive from earlier periods of struggle and what that means for our contemporary movements, but also what has happened historically when this question of confronting police abuse and violence has appeared before, as it did at the end of the 19th century with convict leasing, as it did when the African Americans became an urbanized population through the Great Migration of the 1920s, and then again in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. In really in the contemporary moment, how the lack of resolution to the questions of police brutality and its connection to social inequality in the movements of the 1960s is what gave this movement its explosive character in the 21st century. The lack of resolution to a question that is repeated constantly over time. So it's about, it's about a lot of things. But thank you. Thank you, guys.
I suggest you read it. I speak from personal experience when I say that if I have the flu, it takes me about 3 weeks to remember my birthday, let alone anything like what we just talked about tonight. So thank you so much, Dr. Taylor, for coming and delivering a phenomenal talk.